and welcome back to the show. Manufacturing Hate is a book that's providing the history of demonization of Africa, particularly in Western media and books, newspapers, and magazines from the 17th century all the way up to our contemporary society, and the lingering ramifications this causes in the centuries of demonization, particularly of Africans. Now, joining us to share a little bit more and talk a little bit about this matter, we're pleased to be joined by the publisher, and also he's a news author, and I should say he's a publisher of Black Star News, and he's also an author, and we're pleased to be welcomed by Milton Allimadi. And Milton, glad to have you here with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I thank you for coming and sharing about this because it's a very real topic. When we talk in a lot of circles about the history of Africa and how Africa is portrayed, African Americans, Africa as a whole, right. Of course, we here in Western media have done a horrible job, in my mindset, of really telling the truth. I think that's why so many people were excited about seeing the Black Panther, because you got to see Africans in a different kind of light. But this has been a journey and a life work. So share with us a little bit about your thoughts.
Okay, very good. Well, the first thing that I would like people to think about is that why is it anywhere in the world you go that Africans and people of African descent are believed to be somewhat inferior in relation to non-Africans or non-African descendants? And there's a reason behind it. It's because of the centuries of demonization of Africa and then descendants of Africa, wherever they ended up around the world. And this is something that bothered me for a very long time, even when I was as young as 12 years old. I'm originally from Uganda, and I also lived in Tanzania. So as a 12-year-old, I would go to the US Information Services Center, which is an organization sort of related to the US embassies all around the world. And I would read Western publications, American publications, books, and magazines. And even as a 12-year-old, you could tell that Africans, African Americans, African descendants in Brazil and other parts of the world were depicted in a certain way, in an inferior way relative to Europeans and other non-Africans. And this really bothered me for a very long time. But as a 12-year-old, there's not so much you can do about it. Even when I finally came to the US and I went to college, I went to Syracuse University. I remember sitting in one class, an English class as a freshman. And the professor was talking about that book, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And he said, this is perhaps one of the finest books in the English language. And then he was reading segments from the book, and it was just a category, a list of the most stereotypical racist references to Africans. And he was elated, and you know, young students are impressionable, so they were sort of elated too. And I sat there feeling extremely uncomfortable, but I couldn't challenge him. I wasn't intellectually equipped at that time. So it's only years later when I decided to go back to school. I went to the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia. And for my master's project, I said, you know what, this is my opportunity. Let me examine the history of how Europeans depicted Africans and descendants of Africa historically, and how that influenced how Africans and African descendants have been perceived through the centuries. So I did my master's project, and that was the genesis of what finally became this book, which was published last year in June. Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. And of course, all over the world where Africans or African descendants exist, we're still dealing with the legacy of those historical depictions up to date.
Talk to me a little bit about this here, because as we look at Africans and the history of Africa, this is one of the things I share with people, and I share a lot with young people. One, that when we look at the richest people in the world, it's not the Bill Gates, it's not the Jeff Bezos. We've got Africans who are actually leading the world in wealth. And I thought about this because when we don't see this, we don't know about this. But the fact of the matter is, Africans are some of the most wealthiest people in the world, the top wealthiest people in the world.
Well, here's the contradiction. Even the people that are not in Africa, they owe their wealth to the resources extracted from Africa. Historically, we can go back throughout history through the era of enslavement, where wealth was built in the so-called New World, including the United States, using the labor of enslaved Africans. And then after that era of enslavement on plantation was no longer palatable, they converted to what they call colonialism, where the Europeans now went around the world, including to Africa, to exploit the labor of Africans in Africa, plus all the rich mineral resources and natural resources from the continent. And then in the 1960s, they had so-called independence, where African countries won their independence, but it was largely on paper. Up to date, in the 21st century, the former colonial powers, now joined by the United States, which was actually not a colonial power historically in Africa, but now acts like a colonial power, extract resources from Africa, and that accounts for the wealth that we see in much of the world. And yet, on average, yes, you're right. On one level, the African continent contains one of the wealthiest collection of Africans, but also, on the other hand, it also has some of the world's most impoverished people generally. And this is because largely most of the wealth that is making the other people around the world wealthy is extracted away from the continent and is not used to benefit Africans. So for example, let's look at one product called coltan, which is used in every electronic equipment in the world. Your cell phone, the computers, you name it, comes largely from a country called Democratic Republic of the Congo. There's no justifiable reason why the Congolese should have an average income of less than $2,000 on average, when other parts of the world, people enjoy incomes of $50,000 to $100,000, and yet they're using the resources from the Congo. It means the Congolese are being robbed. And this is just one example. Africa, as you know, has those countries in Africa have the world's richest resource endowment. You name it: uranium, gold, copper, coltan, cobalt, which is now going to be used in all these electric vehicles going forward. The only reason why Africans are not, on average, the wealthiest people in the world is because they are still being exploited. And the reason why people accept this exploitation is because they've been demonized historically, so they're not seen as fully human beings. And that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to write this book, and to show how that depiction of Africa in a very negative way has conditioned the outside world's perception of Africa, even up to date. And also, sadly, it affects Africans themselves, how they perceive of themselves, and descendants of Africa, including African Americans, how they perceive of themselves and how they perceive of their sisters and brothers in Africa. And that has been one of the most damaging consequences of this demonization.
Milton Allimadi is the author of the book Manufacturing Hate. He's also the publisher and also the author of Black Star News. And we want to thank him for being with us and sharing with us in this conversation. Milton, I hasten to think about my trip to Africa recently. But pre-COVID, I had the opportunity to be in Nairobi, Kenya, and spend time with some very, very impactful people in Nairobi. One of the things that we found to be very true was that when we talked about the United States and Africa, even from Africa, the Africans looking into the United States from a media perspective, they were very limited in what they knew about the United States.
Absolutely.
And they even had a great, some of them had let's just call it what it is. They thought that Donald Trump, the former President Donald Trump, was an all right guy doing all right things. And they said that that's what we get to see. And then we, the other side, turned around and said, well, it's amazing because for us, when we get to see Africa, we don't get to see the resources. We don't get to see corporations.
Exactly.
We don't get to see businesses, but
Right.
every time we get to see Africa, all we get to see is the impoverished parts of Africa.
Exactly.
We never get the opportunity to really see
Right.
Africa for its full worth.
Absolutely. And it's through conversations such as the one we are having that we can hopefully begin to dispel this media myth that's existed for too long. And I appreciate any opportunity to have this kind of conversation.
So talk to us about how do we counter this now? I mean, you've got your book out there, Manufacturing Hate, and certainly we want to encourage people to read it to really find out more about the history and how Africans have been demonized and how we're viewed at. And it's amazing because the same thing that's going on in Africa is the same thing that happens right here in the United States. We see African Americans, we see people in communities of color being
Right.
demonized and villainized, but yet and still there's so many success stories that don't always make it to the media. Same thing happens in Africa. How do we counter
Right.
this?
Okay, two ways. We need to have increasingly more of our own media. We have to control our media because then you get to control the content, number one. Number two, we need to challenge the media outlets that continue to demonize Africa, to demonize Africans, to demonize African Americans and African people wherever they inhabit this part of the world. There's a short audio on YouTube, and it captures a part of a speech that Malcolm X made in the 1960s. And it's called, "You Can't Hate the Roots of a Tree Without Hating the Tree." I always recommend people to look it up on YouTube strongly. And essentially, Malcolm is saying the reason why Europeans, when they colonized and controlled Africa, they presented the image of Africa negatively: savages, jungles, fighting. And there's a reason behind it. So to encourage um, the connection between Africa and African Americans and Africans, whatever they be in the world, while at the same time they were exploiting the resources of Africa. And Malcolm also said, as a result of that kind of depiction, African Americans here, they began to develop self-hatred, because is that where they really came from? Even though what was being shown was not the wholesome, fulsome variety that is in Africa, as you just pointed a minute ago. So we need to do two things. We need to deconstruct the history, and I think that was also another motivation in writing this book. We need to create and control our own media outlets. We have wealthy people in this country that have resources. We need to convince them that we need to put some of the wealth that they have into building our own media structures. But as I said, we also need to counter those who would still deliberately continue to demonize us in order to justify the exploitation that still goes on today of our people, whether in Africa or whether here in the United States, in African American communities.
So talk to us a little bit about you taking matters into your own hand. Not only did you write a book, but you also took the opportunity to really form a media company. So share with us a little bit about the media company and your aim and what you want people to take away.
Okay, very good. So as I said, the book originally started as a master's project. We're talking like 3 decades ago now. I had a lot of resistance in trying to publish it because part of it also exposed the role that the New York Times actually played in demonizing Africa. I found evidence from their own archives by going through correspondence between editors here in New York and reporters that they sent to Africa, that in some instances they manufactured incidents that never occurred, describing Africans dressed in grass leaf skirts that never occurred, and they put it in the article. And how did I find that? Because some of the reporters did not like that type of offensive behavior, and they wrote letters protesting to their own editors about how their own articles were distorted. So I used that in my book as well. So the result, it's been very difficult because even up to date, there are many people who are very cautious in terms of looking like they're criticizing the New York Times, even when you're actually exposing the truth. So it took 3 decades, to be honest with you, to find a publisher who was willing to publish this book last year, and I did. And then in terms of the creation of my own media outlet, that came after I graduated from the journalism school, and then I did an internship with the Wall Street Journal, And that was actually a freelance writer for the New York Times for many years. And then I realized that I was only being sent to cover certain types of stories. And I didn't like that. I wanted a broader scope in terms of my ability to write about issues, not only to cover crime in African American communities, but also to show a lot of the positive activities that were going on, including entrepreneurs, including people that were launching community-based organizations to fight against the crime that was prevalent in their communities. And I realized the only way I could do that was by controlling my own media outlet. So I actually drew a business plan. I sent it to a lot of people that I knew had wealth, big names in those days who are still big names today, people like Michael Jordan, people like Magic Johnson, people like Oprah Winfrey. I sent a lot of it, and most of them wrote back to me and said, this sounds like a good idea, good luck. But eventually, I got an envelope that looked like a bill. So I didn't open it for a while. And then I said, well, you got to pay the bill. So I opened it. It was actually a check signed by Camille Cosby. And that's how I started Black Star News. And every time I printed, I would send her a copy, and she sent me a check at least three other times. So I say all this to say that if you think you have a good idea, sometimes it helps, put it in the form of a business plan and send it out. And you never know, somebody could actually support the project.
I want to talk to you about, how we're being depicted and your counter to that, right? So I know in one particular instance, like you told the story about the New York Times, to be even further graphic, one reporter was being chastised for not being too tribal or not tribal enough, trying to emphasize that there's extreme tribalism that goes on. But anybody who goes to Africa, there's a depiction. We see a lot of times, this is Black History Month, people be wearing dashikis and
Right.
the whole 9 yards. But then you get to Africa and you turn around and these guys are wearing jerseys and
Right.
Gucci and
Right. Absolutely.
And
Right.
and there's this misconception. And so the myth, if you will, and the
Right.
stereotypes that have been generalized here in the United States definitely need to be countered. So talk to me about the efforts right now. How can people join in being able to counter the stereotype? Because it can happen on this side and it can also happen for our brothers and sisters in Africa.
Absolutely. We need to have more of this type of conversation that we're having right now. And the good thing is with young people, they know how to edit these videos now and make it go viral and exchange it. And then people realize that a lot of this myth is now being exploded because people realize the commonality they have, not only in types of the outfits they like wearing. People like a variety. I like my African outfits, but that's not the only thing I wear. And it's the same thing for young people in Africa. People like music. African music also, of course, is very much related to African American music because it comes from the same type of ancestry. And now they're finding commonality. Some of the biggest entertainers that have now become very popular in this country are Nigerian artists, like Burna Boy, for example. He's become phenomenally well-known, and his music is loved in this country and is played in prominent radio stations now. So that's some of the things that we can do. We can continue these type of conversations. We encourage people to actually travel to Africa if you can. We spend a lot of money traveling to Europe, traveling to South America and other parts of the world. And we've avoided Africa. And part of it is because we have a certain type of perception of what to expect in Africa. We think that the minute we land there, that we might be the victims of crimes. Most of us don't want to be surrounded by so much poverty, even though there are places in this country that you could go to and find very impoverished people. But that is not the whole United States. And it's the same thing for Africa as well. So we should encourage people to visit Africa. So it's good that a person like yourself, you went to Kenya, and when you come back, you tell people that, no, Africa is not all impoverished.
And I looked, and I remember one of the things that were distinct about my trip to Kenya before I even took off is that, you had to change your money from American over to Kenyan dollars. And as we did the exchange, I remember the line by Eddie Murphy in Coming to America, or it was James Earl Jones, about, look, he's on the money. But the fact of the matter is, when you go to Africa, you find that there is nothing but African Americans, Africans that are actually on there. And for African Americans, it became an eye-opening experience because people got the opportunity to see that all in Africa, the money, the currency, it is all people of color.
Right. Yeah, we need to actually have more conversations involving people that have also traveled to Africa and saw for themselves, because this is the type of engagement that can effectively totally change the perception of Africa within the next 10 years, within the next generation. And this is very important. In the 1960s, people used to have a very negative perception of India. When young children in this country were being encouraged to finish their food, they would say, think about starving people in India. People don't say that anymore. In the way before that, when in reference to China, there was a saying that probably your grandparents would know, that you don't stand a Chinaman's chance, because Chinese were depicted as not being able to achieve or accomplish much. And yet today, China is a global power when it comes to economy, when it comes to technology, when it comes to science. So I say all this to provide hope that these things can change. The perception also affects the reality. You know, the Chinese don't think of themselves as lesser to anybody, so they start aiming to achieve high and accomplish. The same way for Indians. So we need to make Africans, African descendants, think of themselves as not lesser to anybody else in the world, and to aim high and to accomplish what others that were once relatively not that developed have now achieved. And we can do that as well.
Well, Milton Allimadi, I want to thank you so much for the work that you're doing in helping to bring this about. He is, for those that don't know, he is also the publisher of Black Star News and also the author of the book, Manufacturing Hate. Milton, thank you so much for being with us. Got to have you back.
Pleasure.
Got to bring this conversation back to the forefront again. Just don't have no time right now. Thanks a lot, Milton.
Thank you. Anytime you want me, just let me know. Thank you so much.
All righty. Milton Allimadi, our guest here on the Social Justice Forums. We encourage you to stay with us. Don't go anywhere. We've got more on the Social Justice Forums as we tackle yet another issue right after this.